Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Firoze Manji from Daraja Press.
We're providing Israel with all the weapons they need and when they need them. We saved Israel.
And let him finish the job. He doesn't want to do it. He's become like a Palestinian.
With the run-up of the U.S. elections, a competition between the Democrats and the Republicans, one led by someone who's come to be known as Genocide Joe against Donald Trump, another potential genocidaire.
And we need an organized force to deal with the organized force of the right, because their shit is organized, man. We have more of an opportunity to demonstrate what autonomous alternatives can do. That's going to be our task in this next period. And what we fundamentally have to figure out is how do we build and fight in this next period.
I'm delighted to have on our show today Kali Akuno, who is the co-director and co-founder of an amazing organization, Cooperation Jackson, which is a network of worker cooperatives in Jackson, Mississippi, in the USA. The organization aims to develop a series of independent but connected democratic institutions to empower workers and residents of Jackson, particularly to address the needs of the poor, unemployed Black and Latino residents. I asked Kali to join us today to follow up on a discussion I had with him a couple of years ago, in which we talked about the potential for civil war and the rise of fascism in the US. With the upcoming elections in the US, I thought it would be appropriate for us to discuss what the current implications are in terms of what is happening in the US. I got in touch with Kali, who urged me to get this podcast out as soon as possible because it is crucially relevant in the light of what has just happened. And this podcast was recorded before the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. And I got in touch with Kali, who urged me to get this podcast out as soon as possible because it is crucially relevant in the light of what has just happened. A warm welcome once again, Kali Akuno, to join us.
Thank you.
I'm sorry it's been a rather long time since we've been in conversations together. Kali, the last time we had a podcast discussion, you raised some really, really important, vital things, which I think are very much in people's minds at the moment. We talked about the threat of civil war breaking out in the USA and the rising fascism there. And here we are, a few months away from the US elections, and US citizens are faced with either Genocide Joe or Genocide Trump. The difference being perhaps that Trump might bring the genocide home as well. Right. I think there are real concerns here, which I'm not sure people are necessarily thinking about in this way, especially the way that you raised it when we talked last, in which you talked about the reality is that there is a potential brink of the civil war. So give me an understanding of, how do you actually see it? What's happening in the US? What's the perspective, do you think, the pros and possibilities? And then we can perhaps talk about the 10th anniversary of your work in Jackson and to see what perspective we have for building a movement against the rising fascism.
Well, first, let me start by, instead of presenting how I see it, a little bit of how the forces of reaction are posing it, right?
Sure.
To give it a little bit more grounding. And there's many places that we could start from, but I'll start with one, and that is some recent comments by the president of the Heritage Foundation, speaking about Project 2025. And for those of you who don't know, Project 2025 is one of the latest kind of installment of these grand strategic plans that the right has been drafting up and seeking to implement for decades now. But I think in this particular kind of articulation, they started having direct policy links with Newt Gingrich, right? And some of the plans that he helped to bring into office and orchestrate in the mid 1990s, like the Plan for a New America. So this is another one. But this Plan 2025, it's kind of mega presented by the Heritage Foundation, but it's a conglomeration of pieces that have been developed by a number of right-wing think tanks. The distinguishing feature of this one is that there are several prominent members of Trump's first administration, which played a key role in directing this, financing this, and co-authoring several pieces of it. Myself and many others have been tracking this basically even before it came out, because there were some hints that they had been working on this, and there had been some drops of a few pieces about them being the neo-Confederates, the folks allied with Trump, them wanting to gut the civil service, for instance, and clear out the Pentagon. They had been stating these things for the past 2 or 3 years. So we had some heads up about some of the components of what was in Plan 2025. But it was released earlier this year, early 2024. And to the extent that Trump and his crew actually have a platform and set of policies, remember, basically since 2016, he's run on no platform. So he can just kind of do whatever he wants to do and not necessarily be accountable to any particular kind of constituency outside of what he says at a rally or gives his word to. But this one, they constructed primarily based upon their experience in office for 4 years. They learned the tools of the trade on how, if and when they get back in the Oval Office, when and if they actually possess the executive power, what exactly they will do to the day almost of reshaping the United States government. Well, about a week and a half ago, the head of the Heritage Foundation gave an interview where he said, we'll play along and this will all be implemented nonviolently if the left allows it to happen in that way.
And by the left, they mean who?
By the left, they mean the Democratic Party, to be clear, right? Unfortunately, it's hard to speak of the left, of a real concrete left, I think, as we would understand that term historically, or how many people say in Europe or Latin America would understand that historically. The left in the United States, according to the forces of hard reaction, let's call them that, they would fundamentally be conservatives in almost any other country, almost in the world. But they serve as kind of a center-right force in the United States under the umbrella of the Democratic Party. And that doesn't mean that there aren't, there's some Democratic Socialists from the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, for those who aren't familiar with that organization, which are part of the Democratic Party's big tit coalition. But it's the instrument that has a stranglehold on that is center-right, and even more to the right now than Ronald Reagan was in 1980. That's what we're dealing with in the United States, and that's what's being called the left. But he basically said, hey, we're going to do this. Whether we have to do this violently or non-violently, this is where we're going. This is what will be implemented.
So what are the elements of what they're proposing?
Well, number one, this is about a 1,000-page document. I would encourage folks to read it. I've read, I would say, about 75% of it word for word. It is diabolically brilliant. I would say that, and I'm one of those people, I believe you kind of read everything that you can to gain as much of an understanding of the world as you possibly can. And for those who are stated enemies, it's best to know what they're thinking as much as possible. So that's why I study it. Let me try to just give a rundown of some of the basic things that they're planning on doing. Number one, they're going to gut civil service as we understand it. This old adage of, they want to basically bury the federal government in the bathtub, make it that small, make it that inefficient. That is fundamentally what they aim to do. But on the heels of that, they're going to replace as many civil servants with a cadre of people who are being vetted now and have been vetted and are part of a database that they have been collecting that you can apply to make sure that you have the credentials to actually be on Team Trump. And then they will place you in various places. So they're already running in effect. I want folks to understand what that is. They are already running in effect a shadow government, because that's what that fundamentally constitutes. Okay, and the other piece of why they're doing that, they're very clear. They want to get rid of what they call the administrative state and the regulatory state. And so they're aiming to get rid of all the agencies which keep water clean, which keep food healthy and clean, not toxic, which keep the environment clean, which make sure that we're not overly saturated with air pollution like we were in the 60s and 70s. I'm old enough to remember acid rain before these agencies came into being. Not that they're perfect, but they did make a difference in this regard. Totally abolished like the Environmental Protection Agency, Food and Drug Administration, to be more specific around what these things are. They're going to eliminate that, right? Just straight up eliminate that. And I want folks to understand they're not pursuing a one-dimensional strategy here, because these things are already being destroyed by the Supreme Court as we speak. So this would be like the coup de grace, the final, touches on it, if you will. But if they don't accomplish it this way, the Trump Supreme Court will basically accomplish it through judicial fiat, basically over the course, I would say, the next 10 to 20 years, to basically take this country, this empire, basically back fundamentally to the 16th century. So going back to 2025, this legislative and executive way of accomplishing these goals, they're basically going to ban any mention of anything having to do with LGBTQ rights, positions, healthcare. Is disguised as banning men from women's sports and things of that nature. They're going to criminalize any mention of anything that's gay, lesbian, queer, in any form or fashion, deem it to be pornography, and to basically ban it. They're going to reorganize the Pentagon completely from head to toe, reorganize the cabinet ministries to kind of go around certain degrees of Senate approval. I mean, it's comprehensive. We can talk just for a long period of time just about what's within it. But the main piece I want to illustrate is the right, and not just the fringes of the right. Like the Heritage Foundation, for those who know its history, it is mainstream as mainstream historically has been as far as the right is concerned, right? In a major institution and conservative, and to a certain degree, just general intellectual policy construction in the United States for, I think, almost a century, right? Those statements from their director shows you the degree to which not only, has the MAGA movement, for lack of a better term, captured the kind of official instruments of the Republican Party, but also captured all of its think tanks and its strategy orientations. So we now have a full-on neo-fascist power base that is willing to execute this. And I want folks to understand Trump is kind of a key mouth person for it. But what this Heritage Foundation piece illustrates is that they're not waiting for Trump, A, to implement it, and B, should he not be there, whoever occupies it now has a policy blueprint and outline of what to do, how to do it, and in corpus, a cadre of folks ready to implement it. So this is what they're saying, Firoze. It's not me saying. That's what I want folks. It's not me talking about civil war, right? And you can't lambast me, as some of my critics have said about, like I'm exaggerating the case or I'm being hyperbolic. This is directly out of their mouths within the last couple of days and weeks. So this is where we at. And then if you look at it again, they're not playing one-dimensional game here. They got the Supreme Court, as I mentioned, but they've also captured the majority of the states. This is another critical piece that I hope folks understand. And there's a couple of different pieces that they've been doing with the states and doing very successfully. So, they have the neo-Confederate, neo-fascist movement has a consolidated block of states, virtually all of the South, with the exception of Kentucky, and pretty much all of the Midwest is a consolidated base of their movement, of their positionality. And one thing that they've been working towards in capturing all these state legislatures and governorships and the court systems, both at the federal level, but also at the state level, is to declare a constitutional convention where they can rewrite the Constitution. And they're only about 2 states away from that now, having the sufficient majority of what they need to call a Constitution Convention and then rewrite the Constitution. So they're playing the long game, right? And this is a strategy that's been in the works as long as I've been alive. I want folks to understand that this has just matured to a particular kind of crescendo in the last 10 years. So that's one piece. The other piece is I want folks to go look at this anti-immigration state coalition that was put together last year, primarily by Governor Abbott as at least a spokesperson for it down in Texas. And I want you to go look at a press conference that they held earlier this year where they stood in open defiance to federal law and said that the state of Texas and their borderline allies are going to ignore federal law and start controlling and regulating the border themselves, which they have been doing, right, for months now. For months now. Border patrol and controlling borders is a federal job, not a state job. So they are already directly contravening federal law. Under normal circumstances, we would call this an act of aggression or an act of secession against the federal government. And they have already declared, if you go back and look at that, and there's a couple of states that I'll cite, Utah being the most clear, they've already voted on, we're going to ignore federal law where we deem it necessary to ignore federal law. That already got passed. That got passed last year. And they were one of the only states. Now I'm bringing theirs up because it was challenged and then upheld by some state courts. So, these neo-fascist forces are already in a position without directly saying as much. We are prepared to secede should Biden and the Democrats win the executive office. And they're already acting upon it as we speak. So again, this is not me making something up. This is not me like just being hyperbolic. Right now, it's monitoring the real motion of what's already in play. And one of the key things I want to make folks aware is part of what they're doing. We need to be keen to that come November. They basically kind of have a winning hand at this point, is what I've been arguing with folks. And let me outline it like this, that either Trump wins outright, which right now I think he will, right? Because the Democrats are they're in utter disarray right now of their own making. But this piece of trying to debate Trump and take advantage from what they thought of him being convicted in New York and then being able to debate a felon, which has its own problematic dynamics within itself. But they thought they could capitalize on that, and it utterly backfired on them. And now you have, more Democrats, particularly in the Senate, which is the body that matters the most, are now openly saying, look, we need him to go. And in the quiet part, they're scrambling for a candidate, but they got many problems. Number one, this immense war chest that they've been amassing the last 4 years, which right now they still have a tremendous advantage overall in money compared to Donald Trump, but he's narrowing the gap and has been narrowing that gap basically since he got convicted. His fundraising has skyrocketed actually since he got convicted rather than the opposite. But if Biden somehow steps out or is yanked out, the only person who can access those funds is the vice president, is Kamala Harris. Otherwise, they can't be touched. So they either stuck with Kamala Harris, which the vast majority of the DNC do not want and never really were a fan of Kamala to begin with for a whole host of reasons we won't get into here. So they either stuck with her somewhere on the ticket, either as at the top of the ticket or, a writer on the ticket as a vice president, and they choose Newsom or they choose Whitmer. Those are the two most likely candidates. They either somehow get on the ticket to be able to use this treasury or they're not. But either way it go, they are hurting themselves having this conversation out and open and not having a strategy and a recourse. We have to remember they constructed this last go around so that there wouldn't be a challenger to Joe Biden at all, right? And this is how the Democratic Party maneuvered it. So South Carolina will go first, to reward Clyburn, but also to make sure that the Black voting base, which is the core constituent of the Democratic Party, would be in lockstep early on so they wouldn't have a repeat of anything like what happened with Bernie the last go around. And they missed out on if there was a real challenge if there was a real primary piece, they would have known that he wasn't up for a debate at the very least months ago. And they could have come up with an alternative rather than 4 months into the thing. But, with 4 months to go. But here we are, right? So again, going back to the main point, either Trump wins outright or he loses. And coming back to that Southern and Midwestern state coalition decides to go it alone. And if they decide to go it alone, it won't be just, militias like the Proud Boys attacking people. You'll have state level institutions now engaged in direct acts of violations and ignoring the federal government and outright utilizing their forces to protect themselves and or to enforce their version of the law against populations, mainly Black and Latinos and indigenous folks, let's be clear, who they view as core constituents of the Democratic Party and thus their enemies. They will be in position in those states, some of them as they've always historically been, like in the Deep South, to wreak havoc on our communities immediately. So this is what we are confronting in real time in Mississippi, in Louisiana. And if you don't believe me, I want you to just look at some of the comments that the governor of Louisiana has been making of late and some of the wild things that he's been doing. Like last month, he passed a law which says that the 10 Commandments have to be prominently displayed in every school in Louisiana, every school. And he knows that under normal circumstances, at least for most of the last, say, 60, 70 years, the Supreme Court would block such a motion. And so he's like, yeah, I'm waiting for the challenge, openly, boldly waiting for the challenge. So that's one piece, but it's the subtext of what he's saying. The other parts of, like, if the federal government is going to come down here and try to tell us what to do, let them. So he's offering threats like, we're going to do what we want to do. And the federal government is not going to tell us otherwise. So that's already in play. That's already in motion. That's part of the rallying cry. And it's not just a posturing in position, but it's also getting their forces ready, right, for a heavy break either way it goes. So they got to win in hand right now, is what I keep telling folks. Like either Trump wins and they could just get to implement it with very little opposition. I'm sad to report, I think would be mounted at this juncture of the road, or they get to force feed it on as many folks as possible. And then you have the potentiality of all out hostilities and civil war, as I've been speaking, which I spoke to, tried to be very clear with folks the last time we spoke, that not only was this a potentiality, but it is being organized to be made so very effectively by the forces of the far right, and that this is a goal and a pursuit that they have been openly pushing for well over, I would say 2 decades now openly.
But one of the things what we have seen over the last few months is something that none of us expected to happen, and that was this huge rise of young people taking over university campuses and organizing around solidarity with the struggles in Palestine, in particular in Gaza. I saw a wonderful slogan the other day, which was "Make Israel Palestine Again," which was a lovely play on MAGA. Now, there's been that. There's also been previously the rise of the black, essentially the Black Power movement, the movement for Black Lives. So in those conditions, and with a labor movement which will certainly, it seems from what I've read of unionization, has begun to at least grow a little bit. To what extent do you think there is popular opposition in terms of the threats that are being posed?
Not much, unfortunately, Firoze. Not much. And let me say why. Over the last decade and some change, we have seen some really historic, spontaneous protest actions in the United States. I'm just going to limit, since that's what we're talking about, I'm going to limit it. It's been global, but just since in the United States. So, we saw the Occupy movement, and even before that, you saw the response to the murder of Trayvon Martin, right? There were kind of antecedents and precedents of that. But let's say, started from the Occupy movement in 2011. We saw the movement for Black Lives. We saw Idle No More. We've seen the struggle against the pipeline that the indigenous communities were, waged in the Dakotas. We saw the historic protests, what I call the Floyd Rebellion in 2020, right? Which was historic, in a number of different ways. The number of non-Black people who came out in support of defending Black life, that's historic in the United States, and raising some of the fundamental demands that have long been on the agenda of the Black liberation movement, and even some of the more radical ones, coming from explicit abolitionist politics like abolishing the police, and that being raised to become a mainstream demand, that something that the Democrats and the structure overall had to contend with, at least if only to negate as being absurd from their perspective. That it made that showed that the social movements have made significant progress in terms of issues having to be contended with, but we have not produced any lasting organizations. We have not. You see remnants of consciousness. You see a lot of activity from Occupy. You see a lot of organizations that have popped up, since 2014. When Mike Brown, was assassinated in St. Louis. And there were movement for Black Lives chapters that cropped up. There's a whole infrastructure around the movement for Black Lives, N4BL. But, we don't have any coherent political forces. We had a period of significant growth around DSA, on the heels of Bernie's campaign, in 2015 and 2016. But again, lasting, radical, revolutionary organizations, we have not produced yet. In many cases, not for lack of trying, but we haven't got there yet. And so what we are able to do mirrors what we saw with the student protest movement, the student intifada, let's call it that, that there's enough consciousness, right? Anti-systemic consciousness to stand up in cases for justice, for human rights, right? And for people to make some tremendous sacrifices. Some of the things that the students are doing, let's be clear, some of them are making some tremendous sacrifices. The Zionist forces are doing everything they can to ruin a lot of these kids' careers and credibility even before they get started in the workforce, quote unquote. And then the penalties that are being extracted upon professors and administrators for just saying we're going to allow democratic space to even exist for you to raise this point, and people getting fired or being doxxed, etc. So we've seen this translate into some very significant action, but it doesn't translate into organizing. And we need an organized force to deal with the organized force of the right, because their shit is organized, man. And let me be clear about what I mean by organization, just to put it down in simplest terms. I mean that if I was to make a phone call right now to 10 other people, we know what each other are going to do to accomplish a specific task and a specific set of objectives associated with those tasks right now. And we know that this person is going to, per commitment, per training, that they will show up and they have the skills and the capabilities to at least try to make good on the task that we set them out to do. We don't have that. The right has that. So going back to that cadre, that list of people that they're vetting, we don't have anything similar to that. To say, hey, we show up at this particular point in time for this, you're supposed to show up, but you're supposed to execute a certain set of tasks, whatever those may be, right? We don't have that. I'm just using that as a basic baseline. We just call things hope people show up. Profound difference, difference. And we may have a few skilled people here and there who can know how to move the crowd, know how to liaison with X, Y, and Z. But then once that's over, do we have people to figure out, well, how do we sustain that? How do we do that? How do we take it to the next level? We don't have that. And I think we just need to be real about that. What I anticipate, just being frank, is that this next 4 months, there's going to be a tremendous amount of activity set out, amongst progressive forces, is what the term I would use, to get Joe Biden or whoever's on the ticket elected, right? Because it is becoming clearer by the day, just listening to Trump and the folks around him. It's good that, for instance, there's a lot of press that's now starting to get out about 2025, in part by MSNBC and CNN kind of realizing that in part they kind of got to scare people because they don't think Biden's going to be able to deliver the goods. So now the shift has to be from the liberal media, let's put the fear of God in people enough that they just go out despite the candidate and vote out to block Trump and the neo-fascist forces. And that will get some traction. And there's going to be, millions of people pounding on doors, making phone calls, all the get out the vote activities that happen in the United States. That's going to happen at a frantic pace, at a frantic level. There's going to be liberals are going to bathe communities with tons of money in this next go around to try to see that happen. But there is no plan hardly out there, at least on a mass level, for what happens when Trump wins. There is no plan. I wish there was. And forces like me have been screaming, arguing, fighting with people. We need a plan. We need something. We need to at least think about this. We need to at least publicly talk about it. And that fundamentally is not happening, right? So I don't see major opposition being mounted because we haven't had a dialogue of what that opposition would or should look like, how it should be coordinated, and what should it do. It's going to be sporadic. And unfortunately, 99% of the time, an organized force is going to beat an organized one. And I think fundamentally that's where we're at. Now, that doesn't mean, let me be clear, that doesn't mean that there won't be mass protests. I think there'll be a tremendous amount of protests that will spontaneously happen, right? But as we've seen, with the Palestinian support organizing that's happened here in the United States, which has been historic in many fundamental ways, right? But outside of just protesting, it's somewhat bereft of ideas and strategies to actually force Biden and the Democrats to actually have to make a ceasefire, not only a rhetorical statement, but force them into complying with the amount of pressure. We have not done boycotts. We have not done sanctions, and we have not mounted enough direct action pressure on the actual, war mobilization machine that the United States government possesses so that they can't deliver, weapons and they can't deliver ammunition to the Zionist entity. We have not done that. That is just a fact that we have not done that. There's been a few things for folks to be clear. The folks have done some protests against Elbit, and that, was necessary, but it has not reached a mass character. The most that we've done is, I think the most significant thing that I would register to folks out in the Bay Area, they've stopped at Bray Bridge, I think 2 or 3 times at this particular point in time. But, that's a couple of hours. It's a one-off, and the beast puts a few folks in jail, clear the path, and it just keeps on proceeding. So I expect us to do a lot of things that wind up having that level of profound symbolism. I would also suspect that after around January 6th, once the reins are fully in the hands of Trump, those protests won't be met in the same way that he met them in 2020. And he got embarrassed when he came out and had the Bible upside down, all that other kind of stuff. And luckily, Milley was around and contravened all that, on a number of different levels. I mean, we followed exactly what Milley did. When the MAGA forces said that he violated the law, in truth, he actually did. There won't be anybody around prepared to do that at some point in time. And as Trump said, I'm going to mow folks down, and we best take him at his word. Now, that doesn't mean in order to stop this train that there won't have to be some sacrifices made, at least in my mind, in my opinion. But again, we aren't having those conversations yet. I hope at some point we're going to have to get there. We'd have liked to have gotten there a year ago, 2 years ago, 4 years ago, rather than, it'd be December and then now this is the conversation. But I think, unfortunately, it'll be December and then we'll be having these conversations.
It's been in that context that Corporation Jackson has emerged. You're listening to the Daraja Press podcast. Daraja is the Kiswahili word for bridge. As its name suggests, Daraja Press seeks to build bridges, especially bridges of solidarity between and amongst movements, intellectuals, and those engaged in struggles for a just world. Check out our other episodes, books, and more at darajapress.com. So now let's get back to the show. It's been in that context that Corporation Jackson has emerged. I mean, this is not what we are describing is being something emerging since the birth of Corporation Jackson and the attempt to influence and take control of local administration in Jackson, Mississippi. I mean, you deserve congratulations, 10 years, goodness me, to have survived in that environment. And so I'd like to get some sort of idea of what is it that you've managed to do and how does the community itself around you see what is going on, and to what extent are there lessons for us to be drawn from the experience of Corporation Jackson in the coming period?
Let me say number one, and not again hyperbolically, our program was theoretically designed in anticipation of civil war. That is what we always had in mind, me being one of the chief architects of it, but we always had in mind. And where this came from was our experience, my personal experience, and several of the comrades who were part of the founding of Corporation Jackson, doing work in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina and being witness to what the United States government was prepared to do and enabled to happen, to the Black community in New Orleans. Basically, how it eviscerated and fundamentally, just destroyed it and broke it. And that wasn't just a short-term thing. So what happened from August 29th, to the first 2 weeks of September was utterly horrific. And that is what people probably still remember, folks struggling at, the stadium in New Orleans, begging for help or being, stuck on bridges. Those images, I think, are still seared in a generation's mind, and for anybody who saw that. But being here for the 3 years right after that was witness to the systematic destruction of public housing and, the public unions and the school system, et cetera, here in New Orleans, and how it was just designed and implemented step by step to make, as the Times-Picayune once reported, that the new New Orleans, and this was in November of 2005, they'd issued a headline on the paper saying that the new New Orleans will be whiter, smaller, and more affluent. And sure enough, 2024, it is whiter, smaller, and more affluent. So, how did they make that so, right? It's one thing to state something, but it's another thing to be in control of the statecraft, the instruments of how you control the commanding heights through economic policy, through financial policy, how you control those things to limit credit flows, to limit zoning, to limit, who can move here, who can be there, and to watch and witness that. That gave us clear sense of what the hell we needed to get prepared for in the long term. And for a number of different reasons, we thought Jackson could help be a place to fortify ourselves against some of the worst aspects of that, just given what Jackson possessed in terms of its demographics, in terms of the history around struggle in Mississippi. And I think part of our theory has proven to be correct. And part of it, I think, history has borne out that we did not have enough political clarity on a whole, and definitely not enough political unity to fulfill all the aspects of that program. So what Cooperation Jackson has, we have a land base that we can utilize as our primary kind of resource, with a limited number of facilities that we can use for housing, manufacturing, security, if need be, water storage, if need be, that we could support and be an anchor to a basic survival program. Now, how long that would last, we don't know. The only time will tell and the test will tell. But I mean, what I'm most proud of is that despite all of these limits and limitations, we've been able to at least build a bedrock that gives us some positionality to launch a fight back program and to survive, barring kind of an all-out assault on us, which we know could come. Let's not be under any illusions.
Yeah.
If folks don't think that the United States government's instruments aren't capable of burning us out, Just want you to look up what happened with the move in Philly in 1985, just to cite one example. So
In the
um,
60s and the 80s, yeah.
yeah, they could do that. But it was our task, it was our job to put, at least put ourselves in a position where we had some possibility of surviving and mounting, some level of kind of offensive capabilities, if you would, in protection of our community. And that part we have secured. Are we capable of producing if they turn the water off, if they totally, cut the food supplies? We could make it a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks, but that's it. I'm just being real with folks. That's it. But that may be enough time to get from A to B. You know how anybody who's been in a major conflict zone will tell you, any moment that you can get increases your chances of survival, and your chances of survival increases your ability to transform the situation over a period of time. But you have to number one, survive and be clear-headed enough, and hopefully have enough tools and resources and political connections and support enough that you can kind of bounce back. In our case, Firoze, when I'm being real with folks, I say I think we could put up a hell of a fight for a while, but we are not in a situation where we wouldn't get burnt out. That is the reality, just given the nature of what Mississippi is and what it's already been doing. And let me illustrate why. Because in this 10 years, Jackson itself has been under extreme pressure, and it's folded under some of this pressure. And what do I mean by that? Right. So when we started the kind of the round of implementing the overall Jackson Kush plan, roughly in around 2008, this iteration of it, Jackson was a city of about 210,000 people. Fast forward to 2024, it's somewhere now between 180 to 160. And if you look at the official statistics, they would tell you it's a little bit over 160. I think it's more, just the way people don't get counted, don't want to be counted in a lot of respects, in census tracts, et cetera, like that. That's Blacks, so that's the Latinos, folks who have to live in precarious, situations relative to the state overall, but who have to drink water. So we have a little bit more measure of, it's about maybe 180,000 people. But regardless, however you count, right, that's about 40,000 to 60,000 people who have left. Now, I want you to ask yourself why they left. Jackson, basically, since Chokwe Lumumba and now Chokwe Antar Lumumba have been in charge, have been a direct subject on charge as the mayor. Let me put that in charge in some quotes, because being in control of the mayorship is a managing position. I want everybody to understand that it does not mean that you actually have state power. Don't get confused with that, believing that you hold elected office in the United States, you have state power. That's not how state power actually works. And we need to learn that. I think the left, or real left in the United States, needs to learn that. And we can get into that maybe at another conversation another time. But, with Antar being in this position, the last two governors, Phil Bryant and now Tate Reeves, have viciously attacked the city and just basically been stripping it of all of its autonomies and resources. And so, it's the empire striking back. And so while many on the left may have certain criticisms, I know I do, of how certain things have rolled out, we also have to hold it in its proper balance and its proper context to understand that while we may have some disagreements, I may have some disagreements around policy or orientation, the real enemy is the state government, right? That is the real problem. They will wipe both of us out. They don't really give a damn. And so what they've done, just to give a small sample over this last course of time, we no longer have we being the municipality, we no longer have direct control over the policing in our community. That's now controlled by the governor, right? They passed a bill last year, SB 1020, which became law last summer. And now the Capitol Police basically control the streets of Jackson ultimately. And they've set up their own court system to take it out of the municipality and the county's hands, which was in Black controlled hands. So they've set up their own separate court system, to just undermine the authority. And remember, the little municipal judges in the court system, to the extent that there is a democratic enterprise, within the municipality as it's been set up, Black people vote those folks in and hold them accountable. We no longer have that option. They stripped us basically of that option, right? So they've imposed white rule basically on Jackson. because of this Black Power experiment and how it was articulated. I want everybody to be very clear about that. And so there's a backdrop to that. Jackson's water system is collapsing by design. I want folks to understand that. Since Jackson became a majority Black city in the 1980s, the powers that be that run the state capitol, which are the Republican Party, let's be clear, a white-dominated institution from top to bottom, has systematically, for the past 40 years, denied Jackson the resources it needs to maintain and upgrade that system. So they've literally just been presiding over its collapse and its demise. And so it's gotten to a point now where there's water boil notices every single day somewhere in Jackson. And the cost to repair it now is in the billions with a B. Jackson's annual budget is only about 700 to 800 million per year, which means that you would have to, just to cover just a billion, you're talking about 2 years at minimum, just to cover 1 billion, probably about, a little bit more than 2 years of your total budget would have to be allocated just to that. And with the shrinking numbers of the city, which that means you have a declining tax base, declining tax revenues, we're in a perilous situation where a lot of people, because of the economy, because of the shrinkage, because of this attack, many folks who have the means are deciding to leave, and go elsewhere. And that means that there's less fortification for a project like ours. And these are the political facts. And what I mean by how you can control the commanding heights and the machinery and the policy to strangle a place. Jackson is an excellent case study. And I want you to anybody to pick up a paper from the last 3 or 4 years, almost pick any week, and just read what's going on and what the state government is doing to basically kind of weaken our overall collective position and control of this municipality. Now, what Cooperation Jackson has to do this next 10 years, moving to that, we're not going anywhere. We don't plan on leaving anywhere. We got to flip the script and say that we now have more of an opportunity, not because we want it, but just because the situation now demands it objectively. We have more of an opportunity to demonstrate what autonomous alternatives can do. That's going to be our task in this next period. And what we fundamentally have to figure out is how do we build and fight in this next period? What the fight ultimately should look like. And we're having an active debate around that, just so folks know and be clear and transparent. We haven't figured it all out. Normally in a situation like this, there are 3 options. You can either try to go under the radar, right, and just shut your mouth and wait and hope and pray for a better day, right? Or you can make compromises, with these forces, right, to try to survive, which many people accuse Mondragon of doing, for instance, when Franco was in power. There's different views about that, but that's a route. Or we can just all-out fight and deal with the consequences of an all-out fight. Those are the 3 basic iterations, and there's some there's some little mixing and matching of all that you can do. But those are the 3 basic options that we need to pursue. I mean, we have to consider in terms of what our pursuit will be. Speaking for myself, I want us to fight, but I'm also cognizant of the fact that we aren't prepared fully to fight and win or fight and survive. So there may be some need to fall back, a bit and, try to wait some things out. But I think, to me, that's more fool's gold, and it's kind of accommodating to what exists. One of my biggest fears for the moment is that genocide is becoming normalized right before our eyes in the way in which the United States government basically is holding the whole world captive to this ethnic cleansing that we're witnessing in Palestine. And let me be clear, Palestine. Why do I say that? Because there's a lot of focus, and rightfully so to a degree, on Gaza and the assault on Gaza. And folks are sleeping on, in the midst of all this, the largest kind of set of land grabs in the West Bank are happening simultaneously.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right? So it's Palestine. Let's be clear what's going on. And this is being normalized. And I fear that if we don't resist to a certain extent, what Trump and these, fascists basically will wind up instituting, say by 2026, will become normalized. That type of dynamic is my biggest fear, and why I think ultimately we have no choice but to fight, whether we are prepared for it or not.
But let me ask you, Corporation Jackson has lasted, these 10 plus years. You've had initiatives like the People's Strike going right across the country. You're connected with lots of other militants and leaders in the different movements. Isn't one of your tasks is to create the opportunity now of bringing together some of these comrades across the country to say, how do we organize? What are we organizing? And what are the kind of initiatives like the People's Strike that are possible today? I mean, isn't that something that will help prevent the isolation of Corporation Jackson and will help set the premise for the kind of organizing and organization that you've been talking about that is needed? And I think you have a resonance, a respect across the left and the black movement and elsewhere to be able to propose some gathering, even if it just means it's mainly online.
Yes and no. Yes and no. The People's Strike experiment. That didn't go as well as I was hoping it would for a number of different reasons. On the subjective side, like my role was really curtailed by illness. What happened with my back, and I've been struggling with health issues since then, off and on. It's like a bad skip on a record at this point. But what I noticed from that experience more objectively was, the lack of imagination of progressive forces, which I don't think has changed for Rose. I think to a certain extent it's actually gotten worse, at least here in the United States. The uneven political development and education that exists amongst progressive forces that are out there. And the sectarianism, like those three things, we tried to do that, as you remember, you were part of, as non-sectarian as possible. And from the beginning, it was just racked. But even folks that were at that time close to me, trying to get some young black forces in who, refused to work with PSL and some of those other forces. Like, look, this is a broad united front. And there's going to be people who will be in it who you're not going to agree on every single point. That's the point of putting the front together, right? Otherwise, you'd be all be in the same organization, ideally, right?
Well, the French have done it, and the French left have done it, and
let's hope it lasts.
well, sure, but at
I'm
least they've
worried.
managed to hold the fort a little.
It's to hold the fort for a minute.
Yeah.
But yeah, those three things were killers. And I often sit and reflect on the People's Strike experience.
Yeah.
And I'm at a loss, Firoze, to be honest with you. Like, not that we were the only force out there or that we could reach millions of people. So I'm not trying to over-aggrandize who we were and what we could do. But I'm amazed that when we started that, there was still a mass conversation about universal health care in the United States. And by the time the pandemic was over, that was nowhere on the agenda. Nowhere on the agenda. Nowhere in the public conversation. The right totally won that debate. Totally won that debate.
Yeah.
And, you recall trying to get, comrades in the labor left and the trade union to talk to the internationals, talk to the union, leadership, the official union leadership. The time is now. Let's make this push. Let's make this call. Let's make this drive. The workers are already spontaneously striking, and you have positionality around, what is being now defined as essential. We were on that, man. I give us credit for being on that and trying to have these conversations, and just the imagination no, we're not moving. We're not X, Y, and Z. And then we didn't call it that. We didn't invent that, but we were a force calling for moving towards a general strike, right? Not that we thought it was going to happen immediately in May of 2020, but say, hey, let's position ourselves to move to this particular point. That was the point of a people's strike, right? Only to witness, what they called, was it the Great Sick Out, or I forget what, where folks were just spontaneously not taking low-paying jobs or not showing up. There was a year and a half beginning in like 2021 where organized labor had capital on its heels a bit from just like, the little experiment in universal basic income is what the United States government, some Western governments did, like what they were kind of forced to do. And then the reaction to that was folks saying, no, I'm not going to take, these bullshit jobs to quite, cite Graber. And I'm witnessed in Jackson. We had been doing a Fight for 15 campaign for over a decade. That was won in a couple of months by just people saying, no, I'm not going to come work at this grocery store for these cheap ass wages. For me to sit back like, imagine if the trade unions had just listened to us a little bit, or just listen to themselves. They don't have to be from us. Just take up the position. This is your historic role in this struggle. Organize this. And it didn't happen. But imagine if it was. And that's what we were trying to push for and articulate. And it didn't happen. And why I say I'm more concerned is the Movement for Black Lives put together, over the last 10 years, pulled together a multinational, multiracial coalition called the Rising Majority. And they had a conference, which I attended in St. Louis about 2 or 3 weeks ago, trying to pull together, in many respects, kind of a national version of what we did in Jackson around the Jackson Kush Plan. A lot of the same fundamental elements, more social democratic in its orientation than what we put out. But the aim and effort was there, and even trying to articulate, constructing a new kind of elected force through the vehicle of the Working Families Party. Well, being there, the basic effort wound up being, the general thrust of it, just to summarize it, was mobilizing the left to save the center. Fundamentally, what the left coalition just did in France. Except for in this meeting, it couldn't fundamentally come to grips with, all right, what is going to happen when Joe Biden loses, or if he loses, which I raised. I raised the question. I stated there, I had the opportunity to speak before the whole group. And I said, look, I'm putting it out there. I think, I'm just being honest with you. I think Trump is going to win. And I'm not pulling that out of my ass. This is before the debate, mind you. It's like there's some couple of key indicators that he's going to win. And so at the very least, you need to start getting prepared. No conversation. Part because it wasn't enough time, out of fairness to the organizers, about 800 people. Part because it wasn't enough time. It wasn't kind of set up to do that. But that's what scared the shit out of me. I left there more afraid of we are so geared up. Then it's we being, I include myself in that, this mix of progressive forces. We're so caught up in trying to just put a finger in the dike, if you would, not recognize this damn thing is cracked, and we need to warn folks downstream, get prepared, get the foodstuffs ready, clear everything out, move to the hill, whatever, we need to take some action, that we run out of time to do that. I'm already writing a piece outlining a number of these different things. It's going to be a part 2 to a piece I put out on the heels of 2020 and people's strike experience, etc. And that's shifting focus, right? The piece I wrote called Shifting Focus. I'd like the audience to go back and look at that. And the call then was, let's start aiming and positioning ourselves in at least, to start thinking about how do we organize for revolution and not just crisis avoidance.
Let's bring both those pieces together and have it out as a pamphlet of some kind. I mean, these are kind of things.
It's coming. So be on the lookout for that.
Yeah.
It's coming.
What strikes me is that, you're painting a picture of a pretty shitty situation. But, it's flowers that grow on shit, So where are the flowers?
Well, I mean, go back to what I was saying. The flower, I think, can be germinated on the fact that there are far more people with more radical consciousness out there than I think at any point in my lifetime. We just have to figure out how to translate that into organization. That is our challenge. Because as we witnessed in 2020, we outnumber these forces profoundly. But we got to get our act together, right?
Organize, don't agonize.
Organize, don't agonize. We got to get our act together. And we have to remember a large part of what this is on the right is recognizing that their day fundamentally is up. It's done.
Yeah.
Right? It's done. And this is like a smash and grab operation. We're going let's steal all that can't be stolen, while it's still here. And if we got organized and built on the foundations that are actually there, and there's some good roots there, right?
Yeah.
We got to water them, we got to nurture them, we got to make sure they get the best sunlight, that we can position. We got to get some things out the way.
Put us in touch with some of the people. Let's start having a regular series of conversations. We can put out podcasts, we can put out stuff. Let's get that going.
Let's do it.
I agree with you. I think we are in a period where there is actually a lot of hope in that environment. And if we don't bring that together, then we have failed. And so
right.
I'm not
well,
in
we got to at least try. We have to at least try.
Yeah. So I rely on you to put me in touch with people, and we'll interview them, brief them, and so on. Let's just get these conversations going.
Let's make it happen, Firoze. I'm with that.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate your taking time to meet. I know things are busy and that you haven't been well, and I think I hope you're taking care of yourself.
I'm working on it. It's a struggle.
Kali Akuno, it's been a real pleasure, as always, to talk with you, and I think some really insightful pieces here. Many thanks again, Kali.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
That was Kali Akuno, co-founder and co-director of Cooperation Jackson. You can find out more information about this initiative at cooperationjackson.org. Stay tuned for a follow-up episode in the coming period where we discuss again the implications of the development of the elections in the US. The Daraja Press podcast is produced by myself, Firoze Manji, with the amazing assistance of Pierre Loisel. The music is by Sembene Manji. You can find more podcast episodes, our books, and more at darajapress.com. Thank you for listening.